The stretch of the Columbia River that runs through Columbia County is usually gentle and generous, a source of life for countless families who make their living on its waters. The lives of these river folk drift by quietly, following the current, from the misty dawn spent casting nets to the dusky evenings spent untangling fish. Sam Miller, an old fisherman who had spent more than 40 years on this part of the river, was a part of that simple rhythm. To him, the river was not just a place to earn a living, it was an old, familiar friend. He knew every channel, every eddy, and every sandbar by heart. But on a summer morning, June 10, 2025, that old friend gave him a gift he would never forget. As usual, Sam Miller's small boat glided through the early morning mist that still clung to the water surface. He was pulling in his last haul of the day, a net cast in a particularly deep pool where he believed the big fish would be. But today, the net was unusually heavy. He smiled to himself, thinking he had hit a big school. With all his might, his sinewy, weathered arms strained to pull the net up. Slowly, the net was lifted from the water. But inside, there were no flopping fish. Instead, there was a chaotic mess of algae, rotting branches, and something long, whitish, and strangely shaped, tangled tightly in the mesh. The higher he pulled, the clearer the object became. And when he had heaved half the net onto the boat, Sam Miller froze. It was a human skeleton. The bones had turned a dark brown from being submerged for so long, covered in a slick layer of moss. It was wrapped tightly in the net in a bizarre, contorted posture. More horrifically, tied firmly to the skeleton's leg with a rotted piece of rope was a large stone block, the kind of old millstone once used for grinding grain. The old fisherman, who had faced down storms and high waters his entire life, now felt the color drain from his face. He let go of the net with trembling hands, stumbling back to the far end of his boat. His horrified eyes were glued to the skeleton lying motionless among the few gasping fish. This was no ordinary drowning. That stone was a silent testament to a terrible crime, hidden by the river for years. After a moment to collect himself, Sam Miller hurriedly started the engine and turned the boat toward the shore. He did not dare try to untangle the skeleton, leaving it just as it was, and ran straight to the nearest county sheriff's office to report it. News of a fisherman pulling up a skeleton weighted down with a stone sent shockwaves through the region. The Columbia County Sheriff's Office, under the command of Detective Lieutenant Marcus Thorne, an investigator known for his sharp mind and experience with complex cases, quickly arrived at the scene. Sam Miller's boat was brought to shore and became the center of the investigation. Forensic specialists carefully removed the skeleton from the net. The stone tied to its leg weighed over 60 pounds, more than enough to sink any adult to the bottom of the deep river and keep them from ever surfacing. Lieutenant Thorne stated in a low, firm voice that this was a homicide, a clear case of body disposal. He observed that the killer planned it meticulously. If it were not for Mr. Miller's net snagging it by chance, this secret might have remained at the bottom of the river forever. A preliminary examination was conducted right there on the riverbank. Based on the structure of the pelvis and skull, the experts determined the victim was male, estimated to be between 50 and 60 years old. Based on the degree of decomposition and calcification of the bones, the time of death was estimated to be about 5 years prior. Furthermore, there were no signs of external force on the bones, such as cuts or blunt force trauma. This suggested the victim was likely killed by other means, such as poisoning or suffocation, before being disposed of. A murder from 5 years ago. The victim, a middle-aged man. No identification or other evidence was found. The first and most difficult puzzle for the task force was to identify the skeleton. Without an identity, every investigative path would lead to a dead end. The investigation began. Lieutenant Thorne issued a series of orders. One team was assigned to review all missing person files for men in Columbia County and neighboring counties going back 7 years, cross-referencing them with the victim's description. Another team was sent to gather information from the public, especially long-time residents along the river, to see if they had any memories of an unusual incident or a man who had suddenly disappeared about 5 years ago. Days passed, but the results were not promising. Dozens of missing person cases were re-examined, but none matched the profile completely. Some had been found by their families, others were determined to have left town for work. The river folk could not provide any useful information either. 5 years was too long, long enough to erase many memories. The case seemed on the verge of going cold again, just as the victim's body had sunk beneath the deep river. Lieutenant Thorne sat in his office, his mind stretched taut. He looked at the photograph of the skeleton on his desk, a question circling in his head. Why had no one reported a man like this missing? A husband, a father he could not just vanish from the earth without someone searching for him. Was it possible his family did not live here? Expanding the search radius, he ordered a review of records from all adjacent states, paying close attention to missing person reports where the family provided vague information or exhibited suspicious behavior. He suspected that perhaps the killer was a relative of the victim. His order opened a new line of inquiry, one that was daunting but also the only ray of hope to uncover the truth behind the nameless skeleton and the damning stone. The search for the skeleton's identity was like finding a needle in a haystack. Investigators worked through a massive volume of files from neighboring states. Every yellowed page could hold a fate, a tragedy. Day after day passed, and the hope of finding a match seemed to grow more distant. Fatigue and a hint of despair began to show in the officers' eyes. They had reviewed hundreds of cases, but all led to dead ends. One late evening, when the office was filled only with the sound of rustling paper and typing keyboards, Deputy Evans, a young but famously meticulous and persistent investigator, decided to go through the last stack of files sent from a rural county in Oregon. His eyes were nearly shut from exhaustion, but he forced himself to focus on every line. And then, his perseverance finally paid off. He paused at a file that looked unremarkable. It was a handwritten missing person report filed with the local sheriff on May 15, 2020. The missing person was listed as Arthur Vance, 55, owner of a small local fruit distribution business. The age and time of disappearance matched the forensic team's assessment of the skeleton with startling accuracy. Deputy Evans's heart began to beat faster. The person who filed the report was Mr. Vance's only son, Ethan Vance. According to Ethan's statement at the time, his father had abruptly left home after a small family argument. Mr. Vance had only left a hastily written note on a piece of paper, saying he needed to get away for a while to clear his head and would be back soon. But after several weeks with no contact, Ethan grew worried and decided to report it to the police. The file seemed very ordinary, a not uncommon family story. But as Deputy Evans read the notes written in red ink at the bottom of the page, an unusual detail made him sit up straight, all sleepiness gone. The officer who took the report back then had carefully recorded his observations that subject Ethan Vance came in to report in a rather strange psychological state. Although he claimed to be worried about his father, his demeanor was somewhat indifferent and detached. He answered questions mechanically but showed little emotion. The victim's stepwife, K.i.l.e.d Vance, 26 years old, was not present with her stepson when the report was filed. But it did not stop there. A second note, added to the file about 3 months later, was even more suspicious. The officer had made multiple attempts to contact Ethan Vance for an update, but his phone number was no longer in service. A deputy was sent to the home address, but neighbors reported that Ethan and Chloe had sold the house, liquidated the fruit business, and left the area about a month prior. No one knew where they went. All contact with relatives and friends had been severed. Deputy Evans read and reread the notes. A father had just mysteriously disappeared. His only son and young wife, instead of staying to worry and search, had hastily sold all their assets and vanished. This behavior was completely illogical and suspicious. It was not the behavior of a family grieving a lost loved one, but rather the actions of people trying to run away from something. He immediately brought the file to Lieutenant Thorne. In the dead of night, the entire task force was summoned for an emergency meeting. As the new information was laid on the table, the atmosphere in the room became incredibly tense. The veil of mystery shrouding the skeleton from the river seemed to be lifting. Lieutenant Thorne pointed to the old ID photo of Arthur Vance attached to the file, stating that this was very likely their victim. He added that his disappearance was not as simple as his son claimed. An investigator offered his opinion that the behavior of the son and the stepwife, running away like that, was extremely suspicious. He thought it was highly likely they were directly involved in Mr. Vance's death. Lieutenant Thorne interjected, his eyes sharp as ice, saying they were not just involved. Their actions showed premeditation. He explained that Ethan Vance reporting his father missing was not out of concern, but an act to create an alibi, a charade to deceive the authorities and the neighbors. He wanted everyone to believe his father left on his own. After creating that cover, He and his stepmother calmly erased all their tracks and started a new life. This case was no longer a mysterious disappearance, it had become a highly sophisticated, premeditated murder. The entire task force agreed with their commander's assessment. The key to the case had been found, but untying the knot would be a colossal challenge. The culprits had a 5-year head start to run, to build a new life, a new identity. Finding them in a sea of people would be no easy task. Lieutenant Thorne stood before a whiteboard and began to outline the next steps of the investigation. His voice was firm and decisive. He ordered the team to immediately verify all information about Arthur Vance's family and send a team to their old address. He wanted them to talk to every neighbor and every relative, no matter how distant. He wanted to know everything about the family, especially the true nature of the relationship between Arthur Vance, his son Ethan, and his stepwife Chloe. He paused for a moment, then continued. The Tech Crimes Unit would focus on tracing every digital footprint Ethan and Chloe might have left 5 years ago. Bank accounts, old phone numbers, anything. No matter how slim the hope, they had to try it. Their mission was now not just to investigate a murder, but to hunt down 2 fugitives. They were no longer the victim's family, they were the number 1 suspects. The meeting room was silent. Everyone understood that the investigation had just entered a new, much more difficult and intense phase. The case of the skeleton in the river finally had a name, a past. The victim was Arthur Vance, and the prime suspects were the 2 people who should have been dearest to him. The hunt for the ghosts of the past was now truly beginning. The hunt for the 2 suspects, Ethan Vance and Chloe Vance, began. It was a hunt for ghosts who had 5 years to erase every trace of their existence. A team of seasoned detectives immediately headed to the small town where the Vance family once lived, hoping to find some remaining fragments of the past. The town had changed a lot in 5 years. Arthur Vance's old house had new owners. The fruit distribution business had a new name. Time seemed to have covered everything in a layer of dust. But there are some things time cannot erase. The rumors, the stories people whisper to each other late at night. The detectives began their work by talking to old neighbors, people who had witnessed the events in the Vance family. And gradually, a picture of illicit relationships, conspiracy, and greed was painted with stark clarity. An old woman who ran a small roadside stand recounted in a hushed voice that they did not look like a stepmother and stepson. She noted they were about the same age. Ethan was a smooth talker, and Chloe was a pretty little flirt. Old man Vance was a simple, hard-working guy who spent all day at the warehouse and did not know a thing. He trusted his son completely and doted on his young wife. The woman was certain that every time the old man was away on business, Ethan would be over in Chloe's part of the house. The way they looked at each other held so much heat. Everyone saw it. You cannot put fire next to straw and not expect it to burn. A man who used to work for Arthur Vance's business also provided a crucial detail. He recalled that a few weeks before Arthur disappeared, he had overheard a blazing argument between the 3 of them. He could not hear it all clearly, but it seemed like old man Vance had found something out. He heard him yelling something about incest and getting the hell out of his house. After that day, the atmosphere in the house was incredibly tense. Then, suddenly, Mr. Vance was gone. Everyone thought it was strange, but Ethan said his dad was angry and left to cool off. Nobody would have guessed what really happened. The neighbors' testimonies strongly corroborated the task force's theory. The motive for the murder was becoming clear, an incestuous affair discovered, combined with the greed to seize the entire fortune Arthur Vance had worked his whole life to build. While the field team gathered valuable information, back at headquarters, the Tech Crimes Unit was facing immense difficulties. 5 years is an eternity in the digital world. All of Ethan and Chloe's bank accounts had been emptied and closed immediately after they fled. Their old phone numbers were all disconnected. Their digital footprints seemed to have evaporated completely. But the task force did not give up. They decided to follow a different, albeit faint, lead, searching through Chloe Vance's relatives. After days of screening and making calls, they finally found a distant aunt of Chloe's living in another state. At first, the woman was very hesitant and unwilling to cooperate, but faced with the investigators' persistence and persuasion, she finally revealed a priceless piece of information. She said that a little over 4 years ago, she had received a short phone call from Chloe. Chloe called from an unknown number, just made small talk about her health, then said she was living well down south, running a fruit business with her husband. Chloe also told her not to tell anyone about the call. Out of affection for her niece, the aunt had kept the secret until now. Although the phone number was no longer active, for the tech team, it was the golden key. They immediately requested the service provider to supply the activity history for that number, and the results did not disappoint. The data showed that during its brief period of activity, the phone had repeatedly pinged cell towers in a mountainous county in eastern Washington, a place famous for its vast apple orchards. This information perfectly matched Chloe's story about being in the fruit business. The location of the two fugitives had finally been narrowed down. A special task force, consisting of the most elite detectives led by Lieutenant Thorne himself, secretly headed for Washington. They could not act rashly. Ethan and Chloe had lived on high alert for 5 years. Any sudden move could spook them and make them run again. The task force posed as wholesale buyers looking for sources of organic apples. Under this cover, they could travel deep into the remote rural areas and interact with locals without raising any suspicion. They went from orchard to orchard, asking about business while subtly showing old photos of Ethan and Chloe, pretending to ask about old business partners they had lost touch with. After days of searching in vain, when exhaustion began to set in, luck finally smiled on them. At a small cafe in the center of town, a farmer looked at the photo and nodded. He recognized the Vances, Ethan and Chloe. He said they looked a little different now, but it was them. 4 years ago, they came up from Oregon and bought the whole plot on Hill number 7. He called them a sharp couple who turned a barren hill into a lush apple orchard. A good-looking couple and smart with money, too. The only thing was that they were a bit reclusive and did not mix much with the neighbors. The detectives' hearts pounded. The weeks-long hunt had finally yielded a result. They had found the fugitives' den. After confirming the exact location, the team did not act hastily. They quietly withdrew, reported back to the task force, and awaited further instructions. The next afternoon, an unmarked pickup truck, the kind you would see on a construction site, slowly rolled down the dusty red dirt road towards Hill number 7. The truck stopped at a safe distance. Lieutenant Thorne and his team got out, their eyes fixed on the well-built house nestled amidst the green orchard. In the distance, the figure of a woman could be seen playing with a small child. That peaceful, happy life, all of it was built on a monstrous crime. The ghosts of the past had finally come calling. The confrontation took place in the living room of the well-built house in the middle of the apple orchard. The peaceful atmosphere of the farm was a bizarre contrast to the invisible tension that filled the air. Facing Lieutenant Thorne and the investigators, Ethan Vance, after the initial shock, quickly regained his composure, even appearing somewhat detached. He was now a man in his early 30s, with a hardened, experienced look. Beside him, Chloe Vance appeared extremely anxious and fearful, her hands constantly wringing each other. Their 4-year-old son looked at the strangers with confusion, occasionally tugging on his mother's hand. Lieutenant Thorne did not beat around the bush. He got straight to the point. He explained they were from the sheriff's office in Oregon and that a few weeks ago, they had discovered a set of human remains in the river. Through their investigation, they had reason to believe those remains belonged to his father, Arthur Vance. Hearing this, Ethan merely raised an eyebrow, perfectly acting surprised and pained. He exclaimed, "Oh my God," so his father had really met with an accident. He raised a hand to his face in a dramatic gesture, but there was not a single tear. He claimed he could not believe it. He said that all those years ago, after they argued about the business, his father just left. He reported him missing and searched everywhere, but there was no news. They just thought he had gone somewhere to live quietly, never believing something so tragic had happened. Chloe sat beside him, the color drained from her face, just staring at the floor, not daring to look at anyone. Lieutenant Thorne said that to be absolutely certain, they needed to take a sample from him for a DNA comparison, and asked if he was willing to cooperate. Ethan replied immediately, without a hint of hesitation, that of course he would. He insisted he would cooperate with anything to find out the truth about his father, and pleaded with them to find whoever did this to him. Ethan's cooperative attitude and his performance were nearly flawless. A forensic specialist quickly took a buccal swab from Ethan. Once finished, the team left immediately, leaving behind a family drowning in feigned bewilderment. On the way back, a younger detective could not help but ask if it was possible they were wrong, noting that Ethan's attitude seemed very sincere. Lieutenant Thorne shook his head, his gaze distant as he looked out the window. He said it was too perfect an act. A son who had truly had no news of his father for 5 years would not be able to remain so calm upon hearing such news. His composure was the most suspicious thing about him. He was not afraid because he believed his crime was buried at the bottom of the river 5 years ago. He had no idea that they knew much more than he thought. The team brought the DNA sample back to Oregon that same night. The analysis was prioritized and expedited. Just 2 days later, the final report was placed on Lieutenant Thorne's desk. The DNA from the skeleton and from Ethan Vance was a perfect match. The victim was indeed Arthur Vance. The missing person case was now officially a homicide investigation. The victim and the prime suspect had both been identified. Lieutenant Thorne called an emergency meeting to map out the final plan to crack the case. On a large whiteboard, he began to connect all the logic, all the links in the case. He stated that first, there was the motive. Detectives at the victim's old hometown confirmed the rumors about the illicit relationship between Ethan Vance and his stepmother, K.i.l.e.D Vance, were true. Neighbors witnessed their overly intimate gestures many times. This was a classic motive for murder, eliminating an obstacle to be free to be together. He continued, saying that second was their behavior. Immediately after Arthur Vance disappeared, Ethan and K.i.l.e. hastily sold their house and assets and fled. These were not the actions of a family worriedly searching for a loved one. This was the behavior of criminals trying to erase all traces, to run from their past. And third, their current life. They got married, had a child, and built a new, happy life. This confirmed that the illicit relationship from years ago was not just a rumor. All of this logic pointed to one single conclusion. Ethan Vance and K.i.l.e. Vance murdered Arthur Vance together. The problem now was how to make them confess. The current evidence, while strong, was still largely circumstantial. They had 5 years to prepare for this day. They certainly would not bow their heads and confess easily. Lieutenant Thorne analyzed the psychology of the two suspects. Ethan Vance was the mastermind, he explained. He was cold, calculating, and not easily broken. Interrogating him would be very difficult. But K.i.l.e. Vance was different. She had lived with this guilt for 5 years. The burden of being a wife who killed her husband, a stepmother who had an affair with her stepson, and now a mother raising the child of that crime meant her psychological state could not be as stable as Ethan's. She was the weakest link. A bold plan was devised, one that would strike directly at the woman's psyche. They would not use words, they would not use logical evidence to confront them. They would use a weapon that carried more weight than 1,000 words, the raw, horrifying truth. Lieutenant Thorne picked up the phone, his voice cold and decisive. He ordered the forensics department to carefully seal the remains of the victim, Arthur Vance, and prepare a vehicle. Tomorrow, they were going back to Washington. He paused for a second, then said a sentence that sent a chill down the spines of the younger detectives. They were going to bring Mr. Arthur Vance back to visit his new family. A special convoy, including a specialized vehicle from the forensics team, quietly left the sheriff's headquarters in the middle of the night, beginning a long journey north. Inside that vehicle was a large evidence container. The skeleton of the unfortunate father, after 5 years at the bottom of a cold river, was now about to become the sole, and most damning, witness to expose the crime of his own son and wife. The next afternoon, the task force's convoy once again returned to the apple orchard on Hill No. 7. The scene was just as peaceful, with the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves and the chirping of birds. But that peace was a fragile veneer, about to be shattered by the return of a ghost from the past. Seeing the familiar vehicles, Ethan Vance rushed out of the house. This time, his face was no longer calm but etched with anger and suspicion. K.i.l.e. Vance stood hiding behind the door, her face pale, her eyes filled with panic. Ethan growled, asking what they were doing there again. He insisted they had cooperated and given a DNA sample, and demanded to know what more they wanted. Lieutenant Thorne did not answer him. He just signaled to the 2 forensic officers with him. They carried a long, large metal evidence container into the middle of the living room and set it down hard on the floor. The appearance of the mysterious box made the air in the room feel thick enough to cut. Ethan looked at the box, then back at Lieutenant Thorne, his expression defiant. He asked what it was, arguing that they did not have a warrant and had no right to bring that stuff into his house. Lieutenant Thorne completely ignored Ethan's words. His gaze was focused on one person only, K.i.l.e. Vance. He took a step closer to her, his voice low but clear, each word like a hammer blow to the conscience of the trembling woman. He told Chloe they were not there to talk to her with words anymore. They were there to return an old acquaintance to her. He nodded, and the two forensic officers immediately unlocked and lifted the lid of the container. Inside, on a black plastic sheet, was a complete human skeleton, rearranged by experts into its proper form. The dark brown bones, the skull with its two deep, empty eye sockets, seemed to be staring directly at its former wife. Next to the skeleton lay the old millstone and the piece of rotted rope that had been recovered with it. The naked, gruesome, and undeniable truth was laid bare before their eyes. Ethan Vance was frozen to the spot, his face contorted with shock and rage. But Chloe Vance could not take it anymore. 5 years of living with guilt, 5 years of being tormented by nightmares, 5 years of hiding a terrible secret, it all erupted in a single moment. She let out a blood-curdling scream, a sound that was no longer human. She stumbled backward, falling to the floor, her eyes wide with terror. One hand pointed at the skeleton, the other clutched her head. She wailed, begging it not to look at her, pleading for forgiveness. She insisted she had not meant to do it, that it was Ethan, that he had made her do it, that she had not wanted to kill him. In her extreme panic, Chloe Vance wailed, confessing the entire crime in desperation. The wall of lies built over 5 years had crumbled in a single second. Ethan lunged forward to cover her mouth, but it was too late. The detectives immediately subdued him. He could only stand there, watching helplessly as his wife, his accomplice, single-handedly exposed their crime. Through Chloe's broken, sobbing confession, the entire horrifying story from 5 years ago was replayed. It was a tragic tale of an illicit and sinful love. Chloe, in a loveless marriage with an older husband, could not resist the attraction of her handsome, smooth-talking young stepson. They had thrown themselves at each other like moths to a flame. When their forbidden relationship was in danger of being discovered, instead of stopping, they decided to commit a monstrous crime to be free to be together and seize Arthur Vance's fortune. On that fateful night, it was Chloe who had personally crushed a dose of powerful poison, a colorless, odorless drug Ethan had bought from an illegal source, and mixed it into the glass of herbal wine that Mr. Vance drank every night before bed. After making sure he was dead, they waited until the middle of the night. Together, they dragged the body outside, used a rope to tie the heavy millstone to the victim's leg. Then, using the family's own small truck, the one they used for hauling produce, they transported the body. They drove over 100 miles in the dark, crossing into the next state, to find a remote bridge over the Columbia River. There, they had heaved and pushed the body into the swift current, believing their secret would be buried forever by the river. The next day, Ethan acted out the charade of reporting his father missing, then quickly, with Chloe, sold the house and assets and began their escape to the north. Chloe's confession, recorded on audio and video, became irrefutable evidence. Although Ethan Vance said nothing, his silence and the devastated look on his face as he listened to his wife's confession were an admission of guilt. Lieutenant Thorne ordered them both arrested. The cold steel of the handcuffs snapped onto the wrists of Ethan Vance and Chloe Vance. Their 4-year-old son, witnessing the chaotic scene, burst into tears. His sobs seemed to tear through the peaceful atmosphere of the farm. A generation of sin had been punished, but another innocent generation would have to begin bearing the tragic consequences. The subsequent trial attracted significant public attention. With the concrete evidence and the full confessions, both Ethan Vance and Chloe Vance received the highest sentence for their brutal, organized murder, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case was closed, but the haunting questions it left behind would linger forever. It was a terrifying lesson on the destructive power of sinful desires, of blind passions that go against all morality. For a forbidden love, for greed, a son had laid hands on his father, a wife had poisoned her husband. They thought they could build a new happiness on the grave of the deceased, thinking that time and distance would bury everything. But they were wrong. A crime can be hidden, but it never disappears. Sooner or later, one way or another, justice will be served, even if it has to rise from the bottom of a deep river after 5 long, bitter years.